Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Sukan and I'm here with Brian. We're the managing partners at Iterative. Today we're talking about the common misconceptions keeping people from starting a startup. We're going to go deeper into the misconceptions a little bit, but before we do that, let's talk about kind of like where these misconceptions kind of like come from. Um, Brian, I had a couple of like takes here. I'm curious what your reactions are. Um, I think a lot of these misconceptions are come from three things. One, I think there's a lack of like context, and the founder experience is like so varied that I think people are often kind of like talking about founder experiences, and then it's so different for different people. Like people pull the wrong kind of like learnings from different people's experiences. So I think there's just a lot of variability. The second part here is this was not a case when we were starting, but I think popular culture is like pulled on founders and they love telling the story, and founder stories in popular culture are like kind of all the same. And so I think, and they shape those narratives as much as possible. And so I think a lot of misconceptions actually come from because they watched like The Social Network and they think Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook because he was impressing a girl, like, which is not true. And so I think there's that. And then the third piece here is there's so much advice for people about startups on the internet now. I think a lot of that is from people who haven't started startups before. And so I think if you're like new to startups and you're like trying to think about starting a startup, there's just like so much stuff people are telling you, and it's hard to kind of make sense of like what is what and where it comes from. Um, what is your reaction to this, Brian?
Agree with everything. Um, maybe like I think maybe a good way to think about it is like it is all of that, right? It's kind of like you're because you haven't gone through the experience before, you're using other things for proxies where
Yeah.
you're using like non-founders, culture, and like all this kind of stuff. And most of the time it's movies because like what else do we do, right? Other than like sit in front of TVs uh and do it, right? And so I think the other part is like the stuff that you are proxying, they also have different experiences
Yeah.
of kind of like the startup journey and whatever. And so these like misconceptions can like come up for people.
That's interesting. It's like there's like two layers, and so there's like two places where the like real kind of like thing gets kind of like diffused and kind of refracted in a kind of a bunch of different parts. And so it's like
Yeah,
those two pieces, right?
yeah, yeah. I don't know if it's the same for other people though. Like I definitely feel like it's like TVs, like TV and sensational books are like most of where this comes from.
Um, do you feel like do you have examples of when I watched The Social Network, I'd heard a lot of the Facebook story, and I watched The Social Network, I was like, oh, this is a fun movie, but it's just like it just it's like a Hollywood trope of like Mark Zuckerberg is this nerdy guy who can't get girls, and so he's like starting a startup to kind of impress them. And I feel like Hollywood like loves that trope of like nerdy guys do these things so that they can like meet girls, and it's like that's just like not the case. I like know very few founders who are kind of like that. For everybody listening, Mark Zuckerberg was already dating his now current wife before he started Facebook. Like he was in like a relationship, so it like wasn't the case. But do you feel like there's other examples where you've just like seen video shows, videos, movies about startups, and you're just that's that's just like not how it is?
I don't think so because I just don't watch that many shows. But I had the opposite reaction with
Hmm.
the Silicon Valley. uh, the Silicon Valley show was
Yeah,
like too real,
too real.
and I was like, yeah, I was like, oh no, that's my life right now, and I had to like turn it off. I was like, too much stress.
Yeah,
So
actually, I had the same reaction. I didn't watch it for like years, and then I watched one episode, and I was like, "This is too. This is like I think most people think of it as like a satire, like it's exaggerated. And I think for actual startup people, you're like, this is not an exaggeration. Like this is exactly how it is. And they're filming it in places that we have been. And like I'm like, I've literally been in that situation. Now everybody's
yeah,
gonna watch Silicon Valley and be like, Suken and Brian think this is like the real deal, which is I'm sure they've exaggerated kind of like a bunch of these cases and stuff. But I think that's like another piece. Okay, maybe let's get into the like meat of this, Brian. What are the actual common misconceptions, and what can people do about it? We purposely, for everybody listening, there is like lots of misconceptions about startups, like in general, in all different facets. We are focusing on just the misconceptions that have to do with like keeping people from starting a startup. I think oftentimes, actually, Brian, this is maybe a good place to start. I feel like oftentimes when we're talking to people who are interested in becoming founders, I ask them why they haven't started something already, and they will give me some reason. And most of the time, their reason I don't think is a very good reason for why they're not starting. And a lot of times it comes from some like misconception about what they think startups are like. Do you have that experience quite a lot with people?
Everyone,
Everyone.
like everyone that's yeah, everyone that's kind of like going through this. Then it, I think it's like an important question to ask, right? When you're like starting a company, and so it's not anyone's fault. It's just people have these misconceptions. They have to like break through these walls before they start.
I think of actually now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like we had maybe the reverse misconceptions. We had misconceptions that like got us to start a startup instead of kept us from starting a startup. Like I think we just felt like it was going to be easier than we thought it was going to be, and that kind of like helped us start. And then we got in there, we're like, oh my god, this is so hard, but we're already here. So this kind of works in reverse. Okay, um, maybe I'll start with the first misconception here. I think a lot. This is maybe the one I hear the most. I will meet some, oftentimes kind of young person, but it doesn't have to be like an age thing, and they'll be like, "Oh, I've always wanted to start a startup," and I'll be like, "Why haven't you started?" And they're like, "I don't have an idea." And this one kills me a little bit for two reasons. One, there are so many problems in the world to solve. Like as soon as somebody says this, I'm just like, you're not paying attention. There's like in whatever room, whatever context we are talking about, I can point out some problem that like probably needs to get solved. So there's like a million ideas that are out there. So I often think that if people feel like they don't have an idea, I feel like they're just not looking. But I think the second part of this, which I think is um, the misconception here, is I think a lot of times people over focus on the idea, and what they should be focused on is the like problem. And even then, it takes some work to figure out what the problem is. And so I think people who are like, oh, I don't have an idea, and then are just kind of like sitting and waiting for an idea to like magically appear in your head is just kind of like a misconception about how ideas happen. I think in our experience, we often are like kind of somewhat interested in this like problem, and then it kind of takes work to develop, kind of like learn about that problem and what the idea is and all of that stuff. And so if you're sitting around and kind of being like, I'm just waiting for some inspiration and kind of like moment of like lightning in a bottle, I've never experienced that ever. It's always been like, oh, this thing's kind of interesting, and you like dig into it more, and you're putting in some work, and you're like learning about that. um, Brian, how do you, when people kind of come to you and say, hey, I don't have an idea, what's your reaction?
I think similar, right? Which is kind of like, I, sorry, I laugh because I'm like, okay, great, you're not gonna be a startup founder.
Yeah,
Next,
you're like, okay, end the conversation, let's walk away.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
Wait, dig into that a
uh,
little more, because I do. Okay, if I'm being honest, I kind of think the same thing. As soon as somebody tells me like, oh, I don't have an idea, I'm like, cool, you're never gonna have an idea, right?
yeah.
Why do you feel that way? Maybe we're just being, are we just mean? Like, why do you feel that way?
I feel like this is probably going to be the case. I'd be curious if it's all the case, the
Yeah,
same with all the
yeah,
misconceptions, right? It's like, to me, it's just kind of like a very easy excuse that people are telling themselves to be like, okay, I'm not going to put in the effort
yeah.
to look, because when you say I don't have an idea, you're waiting, right, for the like lightning in the ball, so you're like reactive.
It's passive.
And most founders, yeah, it's passive.
Passive.
Well, yeah, reactive passive. And most founders, oftentimes, not even oftentimes, I think all the time,
All the time.
right, are like very active. And so, yeah, I think it's that.
I think this is going to be a recurring theme as we're kind of like going through this. If you don't have an idea, my advice to you is focus less on ideas and focus more on kind of like problems or spaces that you would like to solve. And ideas are just solutions about how to solve stuff. And so I think problems are kind of the place to go. So I think focus on problems is one. One of my, I guess there's two pieces here. I mean, we can talk a lot about how to be kind of observant and kind of like not assume the world is the way it is and it has to be that way. Maybe one hack that I like about trying to look for problems is start talking to a bunch of people that are not like you or in spaces that are not like you or where like tech doesn't kind of like exist. I often think about like a lot of problems have been solved by like a lot of like tech people, but there's so many industries where it's like hasn't been the case. And so I like going to talk to people who are like not in tech and just like asking them about kind of what their problems are and that kind of stuff. And then like doing the research from there. So that's like one hack for me is like just go start talking to people you don't normally talk to. I know a lot of people say, hey, you got to solve your own problem. I just don't think that's necessarily true. I think a lot of people like solve other people's problems and that kind of thing. So that's one hack for me. Um, Brian, advice for people, hacks that you have when?
My one hack I'll contribute here is that think back to your last week and be like, what made me really angry?
Yeah.
Or like think back to your last month and what made me really, really angry. And uh, don't immediately jump to like the thing
Yes.
yet. And then you can start tracking. Like literally just have a journal and be like, wow, that was really frustrating. Like why did this happen? My my best example of this is renting cars in the US.
Horrible.
It's like the worst
Horrible.
experience in the world. And it makes every time I go, it makes me so angry. And so yeah, you're looking for things like this, right? Where you're kind of like, why? Like, why does this happen?
Okay, slight detour here. When Brian and I get together and we're just like doing stuff, we just like cannot help ourselves, and it's weird because I think I go into this mode when I'm with Brian. Brian, random list of ideas that okay, maybe I'll just share with people. Random list of ideas that Brian and I have had when we've just been like walking around together. One is what Brian was talking about, the rental car. Brian, remember when we were talking about doing Airbnb for parking spaces because we were driving around and we couldn't find a parking space, and we were like, dude, this sucks. We should figure this out.
Yes.
Do you also remember when I pitched you the idea of attaching fire hoses to drones to help fire stations? Because we were like, we walked by some fire truck and they were like trying to like put some fire out, and I was like, hey, we should attach drones to hoses. And I give those ones just because I think it's like part of this is like you just kind of walk around and see stuff. And maybe the last hack I would give here is don't pre-filter. Brian and I oftentimes when we're talking about ideas, I mean, like 90% of the ideas Brian and I talk about are just like so stupid, right? And I think you actually kind of need that when you're thinking about ideas and that kind of stuff. And so I think there's like one process for generating ideas and there's another filter. Don't filter at this stage, like just be talking about stuff. Brian once asked me what the purpose of parks was for because I think he was like looking around and just being like, oh man, there's like all this open space. Like,
Why is there a
yeah,
wasted space?
can we like do more
Like, what?
productive stuff with parks? And then you got a dog and you're like, okay, parks are good.
Yeah. Now I know.
Now you get it. Okay. All right. Do you want to pick one?
Eh, Sure. Um, okay, this one happens so often. I don't have a technical founder, or
Yeah.
I'm not tech savvy. Okay, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't feel like I truly understand this one. But I think the misconception is two things, right? One is you have to be able to build a product in order for someone, or in order for kind of like your startup to be successful. I think that's one piece of it. And then maybe the other piece of it for people is if I don't have a CTO or technical co-founder or something, investors won't invest in me. So I think kind of like those two things are like blended together in the like I have to find someone who's technical.
Which do you think is a bigger misconception? The VC funding or
Uh,
like building need a technical person to build stuff?
I I think that VC funding one is just like an entirely different
Yeah, it's a
misconception.
different.
Like you need kind of like funding to get started.
Yeah.
So
Um, I think this is. I would go kind of like the thing I would add on here is, um, I think oftentimes people think of their startup as an app or like the product as an app, and I, I just don't think about stuff this way. Your company builds a thing to solve somebody's problem, right? And it doesn't matter how that problem gets solved. An app is a useful way to solve problems just because it scales really well and all of that stuff. But and Brian, we've worked at a lot of companies this way. I think oftentimes the best way to start is like there's no code stuff, there's doing a bunch of manual things. Like you can run like a pretty reasonably sized business just like off a spreadsheet doing some stuff. And so especially in the early days where you're like thinking about getting started, there's a lot that you can do just like with no code and all of that. And that's just as much of a product to me. And I think, Brian, even as investors, like we've never knocked somebody for doing no code and being like, oh, this is not a real product or app. Like we don't care. As long as you're solving a problem for somebody, that's all that kind of really matters. Sure, there's some things later on that you can only do with an app, and it's like for scale and stuff. But like in the early days, it like doesn't matter at all. Um, Context for everybody here: Brian and I are both technical, and like I don't think we do. I don't think we code anything anymore to start off stuff. Right? It's just like slower and all that. So maybe that kind of hits both of your things where investors will invest in something even if you don't have an app, if it looks like you're solving a problem for people and you have customers and you can do all of that stuff. So I don't think that's kind of a problem. um, okay,
Your turn.
my turn. Okay, this is a riff off of my last one. I think there's like one vein of this where people are like, oh, I don't have an idea, and then there's like this other vein where they feel like they need to have like $1 billion idea right off the bat, and I feel like that's kind of a misconception. um, the thing I want to bring up to people is like even our first company that Brian and I started, the idea was not groundbreaking, and honestly, it was kind of a bad idea. Like we just didn't have any other ideas. And Brian, maybe I'll tell the story. I've never told the story with you here. Okay, so Brian and I were working on a bunch of different ideas, and we had this rule where we were going to work on, if we worked on a new product, it had to be launched the following week. And so we used to have this meeting where it was like, okay, we're going to spend another week working on the thing we worked on last week, or we're going to build a new product. And if we build a new product, it has to go out by Monday. And we got to one of the weeks, and we basically didn't have a real idea to kind of like work on, and we didn't want to work on the previous one. And so Brian told this story about how his girlfriend at the time, Jessica, who's now his wife, like kept going back to this Nordstrom page, and he had this conversation with her about how we can like build her something to like check the price so she doesn't have to like check it every day, and we'll just email her. So it was a price alert, right? There's a million of these now. There was a million of them when we kind of like built this in like 2009 or whatever it was. And it wasn't a groundbreaking idea, Brian. Like even to this day, like I mean, it wasn't like a very good idea. Did you think it was a good idea at the time? I mean, price alerts was like small and kind of like nothing, but we just didn't have anything else to
Let's
do.
be fair. Let's be fair. I thought it was a great idea,
Okay,
but you can
Brian
keep
thought it
going.
was a great idea. I thought it was a horrible idea, but we didn't have anything else to do, and so we just built it. And long story short, it was like this whole process of like, since we had this price alert, we learned that prices were moving up and down really fast, and then we got into this vein of like, oh, maybe we can predict prices. And then once we got to predicting prices, that was what the first startup was about. And maybe the reason why I'm kind of bringing this up and telling this story is I think oftentimes ideas start out as very small and seemingly insignificant, and it takes some work and some experimentation to kind of pull on that thread and see if there's more there. And look, I'll be the first one to say a lot of times you pull on the thread, and most of the times you pull on the thread and there's not much there. That happens most of the time. But sometimes you pull on the thread and it just kind of keeps going. And so if you are not starting a startup because you're like, I don't have some $1 billion idea that's going to change the world right off the bat, I don't think you'll ever end up starting one, because I think it's like a process and you need to experiment and you kind of like need to dig through in order to get there. So you really thought price alerts was a good idea? Brian, there was like a
It was
million of
great.
these.
So much money saved.
Okay, so much money saved. Brian loves saving money for everybody here. Okay, advice on kind of what to do here. Brian, maybe I'll start with you. How any advice here? I think you get what I'm saying, where it's just like, look, nobody comes up with $1 billion ideas right off the bat. It's like a process. Um, any kind of advice for people on how to kind of like start this process and like that investigation part?
Like, just start, right? Just start, and you'll kind of like discover would be my like first thing, and then maybe kind of like the second thing here is you'll have more time to figure out expansion strategies,
Yeah.
right? Kind of like what are the adjacencies, where else do I need to go, etc. So I think that you'll have more time. You can figure stuff out, but just starting, I think, is the right move.
Maybe the only thing I'll add here is in the beginning, don't worry too much about whether this is going to be $1 billion idea. Like, just throw that question, just like forget about that question at that moment. The only thing you want to worry about is like is there some group of people who kind of like has this problem, and do they like would they kind of use something that you're thinking about building? An old adage here, which does not come from Brian and I, is that you'd rather have like 100 users who really care about what you're working on than like 10,000 users who like sort of care. And I think in the early days, it's like you're on the reasonable path if you can kind of find just like a small number of people who seem to really care about what you're working on. So as long as you just like that's like the first milestone. Don't worry about the $1 billion company. I feel like worrying about $1 billion company is like trying to beat level 30 of some video game when you like just started and you're like on level 1, but you're like worried about how to beat the like end boss of the game. Like, don't worry about that yet, just like beat the first level. So um that's how I would start, just like focus on that first initial step. Okay, Brian, you want to pick the next one?
Um, okay, this is a good next one. I need money.
Okay,
Uh,
okay.
it's I need money, or I need lots of money,
Sure.
or like I need to convince investors, et cetera, et cetera. Do I need to? This one's pretty obvious, right? Don't think I need to explain too much of it.
I actually was debating. I was like, do you? Okay, there's two parts of this. I think some people are like, I personally need a lot of money before I can start a startup because of the risk part. And then I think there's the other part where
Uh,
it's like, oh, I need to get funding before I can start a startup. Which one were you? I think you were talking about the funding one, but maybe talk about both.
I was talking about the funding one, yeah. So I was talking about the funding one. But you talk about the first one.
Okay. Um, so I think the first one is it's this risk tolerance kind of like thing, right? So I think some people are like, I need to have a fair bit of money in order to kind of like start a startup. And obviously, the more money that you kind of have, the more risk that you can kind of like take. And look, everybody is in a different situation, so it's hard to give kind of blanket advice here. It's like some people do kind of need more money, some people don't need as much, like that kind of thing. And so I think that one's. I don't want to give kind of just like blanket advice. Everybody's in their own situation. Maybe the thing I would say is I think you would be surprised at how little money you need to kind of get stuff like started, kind of like off the bat. Maybe this is a bigger conversation, Brian, but I think sometimes people think about starting a startup as this like really big step. It's like they got to like quit their job and have a ton of money in the bank and then you start. And I think the way to think about this is like more iteratively, where it's like, cool, start spending your Sunday afternoons working on this thing. I don't know, like put $100 into like make a landing page and like buy some ads, and like you can slow put your way into it. And so I think that's kind of how I would think about it. But I think people kind of sometimes think they need like a lot of money like right off the bat, and my suggestion to them is just like start small, start with a little bit. You don't have to quit your job, like you can kind of like get around with this. But I think most of the people that I know that started companies, when at least when we were young, like didn't have like a ton of money or anything like that. Probably didn't have much burn, but I think that was kind of the thing. Anything you want to add on that one?
The thought that comes to mind is this one isn't really a misconception.
Yeah,
Well, like the
yeah, 100%.
misconception is I need to quit my job.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a
but this is just you have to do the math,
you got
right?
to
You
do
have to be like, okay, cool. Here's my expenses. Can I decrease my expenses? Can I change how I live? Um, can I actually live on 20% less? How long can I live? And you just have to do the math. The misconception, I think, is the one where you're kind of like, I have to quit my job, and you don't. You can kind of like incrementally um, start testing with nights and weekends.
and I think this is like a larger point for everybody kind of looking at misconceptions. I think if you and look, there's lots of misconceptions we're going to try to get to through some, but there's probably going to be more, and people are going to be listening to this and they're like thinking about whether the thing that the reason that they have for not starting a startup is a misconception. I think a good litmus test to kind of figure this out is just like you just kind of scrutinize it a little bit and kind of do the math. And so if you kind of do the math, I think you'll kind of figure it out. So I think that's like a larger point. Brian, maybe we'll talk about that at the end, but it's like, if there's a reason that's keeping you from not doing a startup, it's like, just sit down and kind of scrutinize it for a moment and like do the math on it, and you'll kind of end up in a good place. Anyway, sorry. Okay. You were talking about funding though. And I think what you're saying is people feel like they need funding before they can start a startup.
I think so, right? You're kind of like, okay, I need to get to a place where some other person believes my company gives me X amount of money so that I can make my first like 2 hires, right? And I guess the the way I would think about this is I'm just gonna take Suka. I think that analogy is so good. That's like that is still like level
Yeah. Yeah.
right. Like you haven't completed level one, level two, and you're already thinking about level five. And so maybe it's even more than level five. And
More
so
than level 5.
it's another one of those things where it's kind of like, okay, funding is the result of a great product, right? Or kind of like a problem, a big problem that you're trying to solve. People really wanting what you're building, etc. So one of those kind of like you do at some point if you defeat level one through four.
Uh, as an aside, I feel like we should make we don't have iterative shirts or t-shirts. I feel like if we had iterative swag and t-shirts, we should put do the math on one of the t-shirts and we should be put level 1 on the t-shirts.
Yeah.
It's like iterative sayings. We say this to the companies all the time. I think the interesting thing that you hit on was I think there's like two parts. It's like the validation of a VC giving you money for an idea is kind of like, oh, okay, maybe this is like a thing. And then the other part is like thinking you need to like hire people to start a company. Just for context for everybody like listening to this, at Iterative, we have a hard rule. And I think almost all investors have this rule. If you are not full time kind of working on a startup, we don't invest. Right. And part of the reason we do that is because we want people to like it's our litmus test of like how much you believe in the thing. And so if you need us to tell you that an idea is a good idea, it's probably going to be a bad investment for us. Like you should believe it's a good idea whether we think it's a good idea or not. And so that's like something we think about quite a lot, and I think other investors do. I can't think of a case where somebody raised money and they like weren't like working full time, or at least like had already quit their job or something like that. And so I think that's kind of a piece of it. The other piece I would say is that I think a lot of times, even if you're not building a product yet, investors, as part of the pitch, you want to be able to share kind of like what you've learned about a problem and all of that stuff. And so if you haven't even kind of like done that work, again, to the analogy of like level 5 or whatever level it is, we should map out all the levels sometime, Brian. That'd be like really fun. Here's the like startup game, and like level 1 is this, level 2
We
is that.
should, we should, we should.
That'd be really fun. But like if you are at level 1 and you're trying to beat like level 5, you haven't actually like learned enough even to kind of like raise money. And so I think that part's tricky. Brian, maybe talk a little bit more about like, do people even need the money to kind of do that? I actually think it's a negative. Like, I think if you're starting a startup and somebody gives you $1 million, I think your chances of success actually decrease. I don't know, maybe that's a wild kind of thing, but I actually think they decrease. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's that wild, right? There's like some ceiling of money that's like good for you, and then past that ceiling, it's like bad for you because all of a sudden you're like switching modes.
Yeah.
You're switching modes at the wrong time. You're switching to the like, okay, how do I get my
Company building.
whoa and my like VP of sales, etc. When you haven't actually figured out what is the solution? Is this a problem? Whose problem is it? Like, what is the segment that I should like focus? And so you're not working on that. A lot of money makes it so you stop working on the things that actually matter the most.
Yeah, funny thing about money, if you have $1 million in the bank, you feel compelled to use it. And so you spend all your time kind of using it instead of kind of like actually kind of like working on the problem and all of that stuff. We call it company building. And we talk often about like premature company building, where people are just like, I haven't built anything, so let me hire 5 engineers first. And it's like they hired 5 mobile engineers, and then 3 months later they found out that this works better as like a web app, and they like getting rid of mobile engineers. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is like a disaster. Okay, Brian, advice for people on this one?
And I think the advice is the same. Maybe all the advice is the same. Like, start on level 1.
Yeah.
Right. Start on level 1. Focus on the problem. Solve, like, build something that actually people want to use, no matter whatever. And okay, we should definitely map out these like levels.
Yes.
But you want to get to a place where you're like, you are so convinced that you should be leaving your job, right? Like building this. This is a business, and then it's super easy. Then people will give you money. Because you're convinced your thing works, people love your product, you're solving a pain point, and then you don't have to worry about this.
And I think just to add on to this, I think people oftentimes when we see a lot of pitches, people will be like, "Oh, I validated an idea," or "I have product market fit," and I think these words kind of get thrown all around a lot. My definition for validation is actually just like, has the founder done enough work to convince themselves that this is like a good idea or not? And I feel like that's like, I don't know if it's level one or what, but it's like it is one of the first levels. Like, don't worry about whether you can convince Brian and I whether this is a good idea. You should be worried about whether you are convinced that it should be a good idea. And in order to convince yourself, you should have a high enough standard where it's like you are actually running experiments to convince yourself. It shouldn't just be like I sat in front of a whiteboard and I made this like magical flow chart about how this is going to be $1 billion company and now I'm convinced. Um, by the way, Brian and I have done that many times and we were wrong every single time. So you might be smarter than us, but every time Brian and I have made some magical flow chart of how in 5 years is going to be $1 billion company, it's like a complete waste of time. Remember how much we used to like to do that? It was fun.
So many flowcharts.
Okay,
All
maybe.
right. Your turn, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe we'll each kind of do one more here. I thought this had died as a misconception, but I hear it pop up every once in a while. There's some people who are like, oh, they need a really detailed business plan of what the startup is going to be before they actually start a startup. And I think some people tackle this by like actually writing a business plan. And some people think they need a business plan, but then actually never write a business plan. Um, Maybe a good place to start here is Brian. Why don't you talk about the 90 slide uh, deck that you made to pitch me to start join your startup and how useful that ended up being?
I'll tell the story, but it's not useful. Built a 90-page like spec, right? That was basically like, this is the problem. Here's the actual like product. Handed it to Suka. We were both stupid. Suka was like, "Oh, he did a lot of work.
Yeah, which is true. You did do a lot of work.
Did a lot of work. This company must be game, right?" That was like literally how we started.
Yeah,
But going back to the like business plans again, I think this is again the result of like, who needs to see a business plan? Investors need to see a business plan,
yeah,
right?
and
So it's kind of like it's wrapped up into this
yeah,
like I need to get funding, so I need to get a business plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah. And I think what's I feel like there's like it's like the Russian doll of misconceptions here. Brian and I have never looked at a business plan. I don't think any of the companies we invested in Iterative had a business plan. Like this is just like not like if you think you're doing this because for investors, the reality is that like investors don't need a detailed business plan, especially early stage investors. Like whatever business plan you give them, they're like, I think you just wasted your time. I think this is a holdover a bit from like traditional businesses where trying to get like I don't know loans from banks and like banks need to see a detailed business plan, but like in startup world, this is just like not a thing. Um, and even if you feel like you need a detailed business plan, the like solution here is pretty straightforward. Like then just go write one and then like move on your way. Like this is not an impossible thing. I think we both think it's a waste of time. Like don't even bother. But like if this is something that you feel like you kind of need to do, you could actually just do it. But if you're doing it because you think other people need to see it, then you know it's like not that helpful of a case. I think a fog of war quite a bit when it comes to plans, Bima, where it's like your 90-page business plan. I hope you have it somewhere. We should pull it up sometime. But I feel like you planned out like years of what this company was going to be before we had even started or talked to a single customer. And it's just like the audacity to think that we could like predict that far into the future and what people were doing before we talked to a single customer is just like ludicrous. And I think with startups, it's just like the fog of war is very real. It's like you have no visibility past kind of like, especially in the early days, like a month maybe. And so any kind of plan is just like not that useful. You were going to say something.
Uh, Two thoughts. I was just going to double down on what you said, which is I think traditional businesses like 30 or 40 years ago, you did need
You
capital
did
to
need this.
start, right? Like you
You did
did
need
need like to have kind of like very well thought out strategies, all that kind of stuff. And so it was kind of like a remnant of that. Today, especially if you're starting software businesses, you need
nothing.
the only thing like your thoughts on paper is not going to convince someone more than someone literally using and buying your product, right? And so optimize for the thing that people are more likely going to be convinced on, which is build some early stuff, right? Don't build some early stuff and get people to use it. The other thought I had on this was you do need some thinking. right? Like you're not like like don't write this guy like very detailed. What am I gonna do? What are like the 50 steps to like win with this like war? But you need to be thinking about we have this. We can share it to you if people want, but it's the like 10 slides.
Yeah.
You just need the like very quick like, are there a bunch of competitors that do this? Are there like that should take you an hour, hopefully max. So there's like some business thinking, but you don't need the kind of like detailed
Yeah,
breakdown
and,
of it.
and honestly, I could probably cut down that number of slides. I if you I think this is how the exercise of this is helpful, Brian. So maybe this is the advice for people. If you are somebody that you feel like you need to have a plan, or even if you're not, this is, I think, a useful exercise for everybody. This is the advice I would have given to young Brian and Sukan. You could literally probably open a Google Doc or Notion or whatever, and in one page, and probably a couple paragraphs, try to describe the problem that you're solving. Right. So there's probably a problem section. Try to describe the problem you're saying. You should be able to describe it in like 3 to 5 sentences. Have a solution section, which is describing how you're going to solve the problem in kind of like 3 to 5 sentences. And then if you have another section that is just like, are there other people who are trying to do this and what they do now? You probably are like 80% of the way there if you can kind of do a good job of that. I think if you try to write out what those things are, the act of writing it out will just like help you think through the problem more and kind of communicate it. We see this a lot when Brian and I just got through this. We see this a lot when people are writing out the script for their pitches. They get a lot of clarity on what their business is actually about because you just like have to write this thing down. And so I think that's important. But I would recommend people do that. Brian, maybe we should make a template at some day about this, about like, here's the like one pager for how to kind of think about your startup. And actually, then we could just have people submit that to us, and we can use that as applications. Oh, that'd be fun. Okay, okay, Brian. Maybe one more from you, and then we can kind of move on here.
I'm
Fun one.
too
Pick a fun one, dude.
something, right? Like I'm too young, I'm too old, I'm too
I'm too risk
what are
averse.
other
I'm
ones?
too like I
Too
don't know.
yeah. Yeah, I'm too
I don't
no,
know how to
let's just
use
do young and old.
computers.
Maybe the young and old.
Okay.
I don't okay, maybe I don't know. Maybe
Okay, maybe you should know how to
let's
use
do that one.
computers. Is what you're saying?
Yeah. Okay, let's do that. I'm too young or old.
Okay. Okay. So I think the way that I hear about it from like when people talk to me about it, I hear it in different ways, but I think it's coming back to this. For the people who are too young, I think the things that I often hear them say is, "Oh, I don't have enough experience. I haven't learned enough about X." And they kind of give all these kind of things about like, "Oh, I need to prepare to do a startup," right? And look, I hear this a lot when people apply to iterative. They're like, "Oh, I'm applying to iterative so I can like learn how to do a startup and by being at a VC or like whatever that is and that kind of stuff." So, I think for everybody, they're not saying they're too young, but that's what it these are the things they say, and it's kind of like alluding to this. So I think there's that piece. The old part then I think is it's always tied to risk aversion somewhere where they're like, oh well, I have a family, I don't know, I've got a mortgage and all this stuff, and which is all true, but I think it's like the young part is like I don't know enough, and then the older part is like it's always tied to some sort of risk aversion. um, so that's what I kind of like hear it. um, Maybe we can kind of talk about both ones and why I think either side of these are kind of like misconceptions. Um, I think let's tackle the young one, and Brian, I'm curious kind of what you think. The young one to me is like, and I'll say this kind of out right now. The best way to learn about how to do a startup and kind of be a founder is to do a startup and be a founder. There's no substitute. It's the best way. And so I think if you think that like working at a VC for like 5 years or like, I don't know, working at Google for 10 years or like, I don't know, pick whatever kind of like thing is going to teach you about being a startup founder, it's just not true. I'm not saying that those experiences are not helpful, but if you're trying to kind of find the like steepest ascent in the shortest amount of time to kind of be a founder, it's like just to be a founder. Um, I don't think it's necessary to have any of that prior experience to be a founder and kind of be successful at it. I mean, to be fair, Brian and I have, I mean, maybe we were better off getting more experience, but Brian and I basically had no experience being founders when we started, and I don't think that's necessary. I actually think sometimes it can be counterproductive. My gripe with young people who want to start startups and join VCs is that they learn how to they learn all the reasons why startups don't work, and I think it actually makes them hard. It makes it harder for them to eventually start a startup, and so I think that's kind of the case. If you work at a large company, I think it makes it harder for you to start a startup because you learn all these ways about how big companies do things, and I think they're just not. They don't work very well for an early stage startup. So you're actually learning like the wrong things for that. So I think if you feel like you don't know enough and all of this kind of stuff, I think that's a misconception. It doesn't help you. I think all of that stuff. Hey, what do you think about young people joining VCs who want to be startups? This could be a whole nother topic, but I have strong feelings here.
I think my thought here is being a founder is very different than being a VC.
Yep.
And so joining a VC is fine. You're on the VC path,
Yeah.
right? And then starting a startup is fine. You're on the startup path,
Path. Yep.
right? And you can make a kind of like switch, but just think about it as a career change.
Yep.
Um, so
Yep.
yeah, that's how I think about it.
Um. Okay. What about the too old one where they're like risk aversion and all that kind of stuff? What is your take there? How should people think about it?
Yeah,
Why do you think it's a misconception?
yeah. I actually think there's two things here. One is the like risk inversion thing, and then I think the other one is the kind of like, oh, investors don't fund old people.
Yeah.
And so maybe the there's actually some study, I forgot what the study was, but if you look at like the most successful founders, like
They're
the
actually
percent of
older.
people who are actually much older.
Yeah.
They're like 40s or whatever, right? And you're hearing about all the kind of like very young people starting startups because those are the ones that are just more exciting, right? Like someone who's like 16 years old, like built this giant company. And so it's just kind of like the media bias. So I know that's like a pretty clear misconception for me. Like old people,
Old
old
people.
people with beards to get included, are, have an advantage, right? Because
Yeah.
all of a sudden you have
100%.
like all this experience, all this kind of
100%.
like, domain knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. And so kind of like uh, I would look at, as a VC, I would look at that and be like, oh, okay, more experience, more thoughtful, more intentional. They're starting a company. That's like a plus, not like a minus. So that's the kind of like VC part. Um, on the risk aversion part, uh, like to me again, that's just like a math equation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Just do the
Like
math.
that's just like, okay, what is the
Yeah.
like amount of risk I'm willing to take because now I have kids. My like budget for like a reasonable like lifestyle is like higher,
Yep.
or and kind of like what am I willing to sacrifice and all this kind of stuff. So I don't know if it's a misconception, but it's just math. Like do the math.
Yep.
You can still start a company. People will still fund you. Um, etc.
Maybe the only thing I'll add here is that the, it does turn out that founders kind of in their like 30s, 40s, 50s are kind of like more successful. They also tend to work on more B2B companies. And so I think media likes to tell the story of kind of like 22-year-old person who kind of like caught lightning in a bottle kind of stuff. But they also like to tell more stories about consumer businesses because more people use those consumer ones, and consumer businesses like TikTok and those kind of Instagram, that kind of things are kind of disproportionately started by younger people. But most of the kind of like big businesses and like that kind of stuff, at least in B2B stuff, are started kind of by people who are further in their career. And that just makes sense. They were exposed to these things. Brian and I love investing in people who are like worked in an industry and then starting a startup to kind of like work on that industry. It's like awesome. So we're very happy to do that. Okay, Brian, maybe last part here. Let's, we've been kind of giving advice as kind of as we're going. I want to do like just like high level takeaway, and I feel like we've been talking about these things, so let's just like hit them home as we wrap this up. Maybe the thing that I will kind of say for a lot of these is, if you're somebody who's thinking about starting a startup and there's something that's keeping you from doing it, I think my advice here is to like, you kind of need to be honest with yourself about whether the thing that's holding you back is like a real thing or not. Oftentimes I feel like people rationalize fear, and so they're like afraid of doing a startup, or it's a big risk, and it's all of those things. I'm not trying to tell people that it's not, but then they kind of like rationalize that, and they're like, they pick a reason that other people have kind of said or seems tangible, and they use that to kind of like rationalize why they're worried about it. um, and my advice to them is like, kind of be honest, see if that's kind of what you're doing, and if the reason that you have for not doing a startup, uh, just do the math on it, right? It's just like, okay, if you're worried about the risk, like sit down and grapple with the risk. Like, okay, what is the real risk here? What is your runway? What are you willing to give up? So you can do the math there. And then the other part of de-risking is like work on whatever the idea is in your like spare time, right? Be like, cool, Sunday afternoons, I'm going to work on my startup. And so you can, on one hand, get an understanding of what the downside is and how much runway you have for that. And then on the other side is you can get increased kind of like conviction around what you're working on. And I think if you tackle both of those at the same time, it will help you kind of get over some of this fear. But if you just kind of sit and you're like, okay, there's this like thing and I'm not doing anything about it, you're never going to get off the sidelines here. So that's my kind of piece of advice. Brian, do you have a different one you want to add on to mine?
It's our t-shirts again. It's solve level, go after level one.
Yep.
Before you like think about. I think most of these misconceptions are like you're thinking about level 10.
Yeah.
Or you're thinking about
100%.
level 100, right? You're like you're thinking too far ahead, and you're like, wow, that is so far. Okay, this is gonna be really bad because I'm so bad at sports.
I did.
Like,
Brian plays no sports, by the way, for everybody. He does not care about
zero
sports.
sports. But you're like, okay, can I be an Olympic swimmer? That's what you're like thinking, right?
Yeah.
And then you don't even know how to swim. You've never done it in your life, or whatever. Like the first step is like touch the water, like put your like toes into the water, right? And then see if you can like submerge your up to your neck or something.
Yeah.
Right? I don't even know what people are supposed to do, but like you're. And I think you're like building confidence, right? Like you're doing all these baby steps, you're building confidence. You're kind of like, so yeah, just I don't know if this is good advice from that. Like think less, do more, right? It's kind of like what I think we should do.
I think the swimmer one is like a really good analogy. It's almost like getting VC funding is like worrying about being sponsored and you haven't like swam at all. It's like, oh yeah, how am I going to get Nike to sponsor me as a swimmer? And it's like, I haven't gotten the pool at all, right? It's like Nike sponsors you as a result of kind of all the stuff you do, but like you need to worry about getting in the pool and that kind of stuff. So, wow, Bima, not bad for not playing any sports. Like pretty good.
I feel like at some point in my life, I should do some sport.
You should do some sport. I wonder what sport that would.
I don't know.
I don't know either. Brian, also hand-eye coordination. Not great. So we'll have to figure out what that is. Okay, maybe we'll kind of end on that. I think it's like, if we're summarizing this podcast, it is do the math and start on level 1, not level 5. All right, thanks, Brian. Thanks for listening. If you like this podcast, subscribe to our channel. June says that she has OKRs to hit. June is the one that's helping us with this. She has OKRs to hit. Help June with her OKRs. That should just be the tagline at the end of all. It's just like at the end of every episode, it's like
help June with her OKRs.
Yeah, hashtag help June with her OKRs. Thanks everybody.